When a racist woman, driven by baseless prejudice, decides to call the police on a young Mexican, she never imagined that his mother's powerful and determined arrival would change everything, leaving her utterly speechless and exposing the raw truth behind her unfounded hate. Sofia Reyes had always believed that life's most significant changes announced themselves. A dramatic phone call, a sudden storm, or at the very least, an uneasy feeling that morning. But on this ordinary Tuesday in April, as she hurried across the polished lobby of Westlake Memorial Hospital, where she'd worked for 12 years, nothing warned her that by evening, everything would be different. Dr. Reyes, trauma incoming. 5 minutes. The voice crackled over her pager as she reached for her coffee. At 43, Sofia had the kind of face that patients trusted immediately, deep brown eyes that missed nothing, laugh lines that suggested empathy, and a decisive manner that communicated competence without arrogance. Her colleagues often joked that her short-cropped hair was the only impulsive decision she'd ever made. They weren't entirely wrong. Sofia's life ran on careful planning and measured responses. "What do we have?" she asked, joining the trauma. Team assembling in the ER. Multi-vehicle collision on the parkway, 3 critical, 2 moderate. First arrival has a traumatic head injury. Nurse Wilson handed her a clipboard while the team prepped the bay. Sofia nodded, slipping into the practiced rhythm of emergency medicine. This was her element, where chaos yielded to protocol, where her decisions had immediate consequences, where the line between life and death was clear and navigable. Unlike the rest of her life, which had become a study in avoided conversations and comfortable distance. The ambulance doors burst open, and time compressed into a series of urgent commands and swift movements. Sofia worked methodically, assessing the unconscious man on the gurney. Late 60s, severe head trauma, unequal pupils, decreasing vital signs. Her hands moved with practiced precision, intubating while calling for immediate CT and surgical consult. It wasn't until they transferred him to imaging that Sofia saw his face properly. The recognition hit her with physical force. Carlos Mendoza, her mother's husband of 10 years. The man who'd been more of a father to her than her biological one ever was. The man she hadn't spoken to in almost 3 years. Dr. Reyes? Someone was saying her name, but it sounded far away. "I know him," she managed. "He's my stepfather." The next hour passed in a surreal blur. Sofia forced herself to maintain professional distance as the CT results confirmed what she already suspected. Catastrophic brain injury with little chance of recovery. She mechanically performed her duties, stabilized him for surgery that likely wouldn't save him, and then did something she'd never done before. She asked to be relieved from the case. In the quiet of her office, Sofia's hands shook as she dialed her mother's number. Eleanor answered on the 4th ring, her voice bright with the particular enthusiasm she reserved for Sofia's infrequent calls. "Sofia, what a lovely surprise. I was just thinking—" "Mom," Sofia interrupted, her doctor's voice taking over. "It's about Carlos. There's been an accident." The silence that followed contained all the weight of their complicated relationship, of the unspoken resentments, the careful distances maintained, the love that persisted despite it all. "How bad?" Eleanor finally asked, her voice thinning to something barely recognizable. "You should come quickly," Sofia said, which was answer enough. Across town, in a converted industrial loft that served as both home and workspace, Miguel Alvarez stared at the half-finished installation piece that had consumed the last 8 months of his life. At 35, he had finally achieved what other artists his age could only dream of: gallery representation, critical recognition, and enough financial stability to create without compromise. His upcoming exhibition, exploring themes of memory and impermanence, was already generating buzz in the local art scene. Miguel stood back, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the concrete floor. His most distinguishing features, intense, hazel eyes and a jagged scar along his right jaw from a childhood accident, were accentuated in the studio's dramatic lighting. On his workbench, his phone vibrated with an incoming text. Reminder: hospital volunteer shift tomorrow, 2 to 5 p.m. Pediatric wing, bring puppets. Miguel smiled, brushing sawdust from his hands. His weekly storytelling sessions with the children at Westlake Memorial had begun as community service hours required by his previous gallery, but had become the most grounding part of his week. Few people in his professional circle knew about this side of his life. The puppets he crafted for sick children. The stories he told that transported them temporarily from their hospital beds. He preferred to keep these worlds separate. His phone rang, the special ringtone he'd assigned to only one person. He answered immediately. "Elena, hey, I was just thinking about you." "Miguel." Elena's voice was fragile in a way he'd never heard before. "Carlos has been in an accident. He's at Westlake Memorial. Sophia says it's not good." Miguel closed his eyes, memories flooding back. Carlos's booming laugh at family dinners, his patient explanations of carpentry techniques, the quiet ways he'd supported Miguel's art when everyone else questioned his choices. The man who'd welcomed him as Elena's godson and treated him like family when his own parents couldn't accept his decision to pursue art. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, he said, already reaching for his keys. "Do you need me to pick you up?" "No, Sophia's sending a hospital car for me." There was a pause. "She doesn't know I'm calling you." Of course she doesn't, Miguel thought. Sophia, who had methodically excised him from her life 3 years ago, who had returned his letters unopened, who had made it clear that whatever had existed between them was irreparably broken. "I'll be there anyway," he said. The waiting room outside the neurological ICU was designed to be comforting, with its soft lighting and muted colors, but it felt to Sophia like a liminal space, neither here nor there, a room designed for suspension between hope and grief. She had changed out of her scrubs into the spare clothes she kept in her office, trying to transform herself from physician to family member. The transition felt incomplete. When Elena arrived, Sophia was struck by how much her mother had aged in the 3 years since they'd last seen each other. At 68, Elena had always possessed a vibrant energy that belied her years, but grief had already begun to etch itself into the corners of her mouth, the slope of her shoulders. "Where is he?" Elena asked, foregoing any greeting. "They're finishing in surgery. Dr. Patel will be out soon to talk to us." Sophia hesitated, then added, "Mom, the damage is extensive. You should prepare yourself." Elena's eyes flashed. "Don't use your doctor voice with me, Sophia, not now." The rebuke stung, but Sophia nodded, recognizing the fear behind her mother's anger. They sat in silence, the weight of unspoken words between them growing heavier with each passing minute. The sound of approaching footsteps broke their silent vigil. Sophia looked up, expecting to see Dr. Patel, but instead found herself staring at a ghost from her past. Miguel stood in the doorway, his familiar form silhouetted against the harsh hallway lights. For a moment, Sophia couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only feel the rush of memories she'd spent 3 years suppressing. "What are you doing here?" she managed finally, her voice sounding foreign to her own ears. "I called him," Elena said, rising to embrace Miguel. "We need all the family we can get right now." Family. The word hung in the air between them. Once Sophia had believed that Miguel would be her family in every sense of the word. Now the sight of him, thinner than she remembered, with new lines around his eyes, made her feel as though she was standing on shifting ground. "I'm sorry about Carlos," Miguel said, his voice careful, neutral. "How is he?" "Not good," Sophia said, falling back on clinical terms because she didn't trust herself with anything more emotional. "He suffered a severe traumatic brain injury. The surgical team is trying to reduce the pressure, but she didn't need to. Finish." Miguel nodded, understanding the unspoken prognosis. He took a seat beside Elena, offering his hand, which her mother grasped like a lifeline. Sophia remained standing, suddenly an outsider in this tableau of shared grief. She watched as Miguel murmured something to her mother that made Elena nod, her face softening briefly. The ease between them, the intimacy of long association, pierced Sophia with a complicated emotion she couldn't immediately identify. When Dr. Patel finally appeared, his expression confirmed what Sophia already knew. Carlos had survived the surgery, but the prognosis was grim. He was on a ventilator, unresponsive, with little brain activity. The next 24 to 48 hours would be critical, but they should prepare for difficult decisions ahead. Elena listened with remarkable composure, asking precise questions that suggested she had anticipated this outcome. When she finally broke down, it was Miguel who supported her, his arm steady around her shoulders. "I'd like to see him now," Elena said when she had regained control. Dr. Patel nodded. "Of course, the nurse will take you." As Elena followed the nurse, Sophia made to accompany her, but her mother turned with unexpected sharpness. "Give me a few minutes alone with my husband first." Sophia stopped, stung by the dismissal. She watched her mother disappear down the corridor, then became acutely aware that she was now alone with Miguel. "You look well," he said after a moment, breaking the excruciating silence. Sophia almost laughed at the absurdity of small talk in this situation. "Let's not do this, Miguel." "Do what?" "Acknowledge each other. It's been 3 years, Sophia." "And whose fault is that?" The words escaped before she could stop them. Miguel's expression hardened. "Still blaming me for everything, I see. Some things never change." "I'm not having this conversation here. Not today." Sophia gathered her professional demeanor around her like armor. "Carlos is dying, that's what matters right now." The bluntness of her statement seemed to penetrate Miguel's defenses. His shoulders sagged slightly. "You're right. I'm sorry." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so familiar it made Sophia's chest ache. "Elena needs both of us right now. We can put aside whatever this is, for her sake." Sophia nodded, grateful for the reprieve, however temporary. "I should check on her." As she walked away, she felt Miguel's eyes following her, and with each step the weight of their unresolved past seemed to grow heavier, echoing in the sterile hospital corridors like a second heartbeat. The next 24 hours unfolded in a blur of hospital routines and tense waiting. Carlos remained unresponsive, his condition neither improving nor deteriorating. Elena maintained a constant vigil by his bedside, speaking to him in low tones about everyday matters, as if he could hear her. Perhaps he could, Sophia thought, though her medical training suggested otherwise. Miguel came and went, bringing food that no one ate, making calls on Elena's behalf, filling the silences with a quiet competence that Sophia had once relied on. They orbited each other cautiously, maintaining a careful distance while sharing the same gravitational pull of concern for Elena and Carlos. During one of her mother's brief rest periods, Sophia found herself alone in Carlos's room. The rhythmic sounds of the ventilator and monitoring equipment created an artificial lullaby that couldn't mask the fundamental wrongness of seeing this vital man reduced to a collection of failing systems. Sophia took Carlos's hand, noting the familiar calluses from years of woodworking, hands that had taught her to build her first birdhouse, that had steadied her bicycle, that had walked her down the aisle at her wedding. The wedding that Miguel had photographed, capturing moments of joy that now felt like artifacts from someone else's life. "I should have called more," she said quietly to Carlos's unresponsive form. "I shouldn't have let things get so distant." "He understood why you stayed away." Sophia startled. Miguel stood in the doorway, 2 coffee cups in hand. He offered one to her, a peace offering she accepted after a moment's hesitation. "Did he tell you that?" she asked, taking a careful sip. Miguel moved into the room, keeping the hospital bed between them like a buffer. "Not in so many words, but he talked about you all the time. He was proud of you, Sophia. He kept a newspaper clipping about your research in his wallet." This revelation hit Sophia with unexpected force. She had assumed that Carlos, like her mother, had written her off after the divorce, after she had retreated into her work and systematically dismantled the life they had all once shared. "I didn't know," she said, her voice small. "There's a lot you don't know." Miguel's tone wasn't accusatory, just matter of fact. "You disappeared, Sophia. Not just from me, from everyone who cared about you." Sophia looked up sharply. "I didn't disappear. I made a choice to focus on my career after..." She stopped, unwilling to name the loss that had driven them apart. After everything, Miguel held her gaze, and for a moment she could see the man she had loved, earnest, unflinching, with an artist's capacity to see beneath surfaces. "Is that what you tell yourself?" Before she could respond, the monitors attached to Carlos began to signal distress. Sophia's professional instincts took over immediately. She pressed the emergency call button and began checking vitals, aware of Miguel backing away to make room for the medical team that rushed in. Sophia found herself in the strange position of being both family member and physician, watching as her colleagues fought to stabilize the man who had been more father to her than her biological one. She understood with clinical clarity exactly what was happening. Carlos's body was failing, his systems shutting down one by one despite medical intervention. When it was over, when the team had done everything possible and it still wasn't enough, Dr. Patel turned to Sophia with profound sympathy. "I'm sorry, Dr. Reyes, his heart couldn't sustain the strain." Sophia nodded, medical terminology a shield against the emotional reality. "I'll tell my mother." The walk to the family waiting room felt endless. Sophia rehearsed the words in her mind, searching for the right combination of gentleness and truth. But when she saw Elena, sitting with Miguel, exhaustion etched into every line of her face, all her carefully prepared phrases evaporated. "Mom," she said, and something in her voice must have communicated everything, because Elena's face crumpled before she even finished speaking. "He's gone." The next moments passed in a haze of grief. Sophia watched as her mother broke down, as Miguel enveloped Elena in a protective embrace, as hospital staff moved with practiced sensitivity around their loss. She stood slightly apart, performing her role as the doctor-daughter, handling paperwork, making necessary calls, managing details so that others could focus on their grief. It wasn't until much later, after Elena had been sedated and taken to Sophia's apartment by a hospital volunteer, that Sophia finally allowed herself to feel. She found herself in the hospital chapel, not from any religious impulse, but because it was the only quiet space available in the bustling hospital. She sat in the last row, beneath stained glass that cast colored shadows across the empty pews, and finally let the tears come. She cried for Carlos, for the relationship they'd never fully repaired, for all the conversations that would now remain theoretical. She cried for her mother, facing widowhood after finding happiness in a second marriage. And finally, she cried for herself, for the woman who had become so adept at emotional distance that she no longer knew how to close the gaps she had created. She didn't hear Miguel enter, didn't realize she wasn't alone until he sat beside her, close but not touching. "I thought I might find you here," he said quietly. Sophia wiped her eyes, embarrassed to be caught in vulnerability. "How did you know?" "You always did this, found the quietest place to process things on your own." There was no judgment in his observation, just familiarity. Some things don't change. They sat in silence for several minutes, the chapel's hushed atmosphere enveloping them like a cocoon, suspending them temporarily outside the hospital's relentless pace and the grief that awaited them. "I keep thinking, about time," Sophia said finally. "How much of it I wasted with Carlos, with Mom." She hesitated. "With you?" Miguel turned to look at her, his expression carefully neutral. "Are we finally going to talk about it?" Sophia traced the grain of the wooden pew with her fingertip. "I don't know if I can." "It's been 3 years, Sophia. The baby would have been 2.5 by now." The words landed like physical blows. Their baby. The daughter they had named Isabella even before they knew her gender. The child they had decorated a nursery for, whose future they had planned with cautious excitement, whose existence had transformed them from a couple into almost parents, until the hemorrhage at 28 weeks that had ended everything. "I know exactly how old she would be," Sophia said, her voice barely audible. "I think about it every day." Miguel's hand moved as if to reach for hers, then stopped. "You never let me help you through it. You just shut down, built walls, made it clear there was no room for me in your grief. Because you wanted to try again, Sophia said, the old argument surfacing with surprising force. You wanted to move forward and I couldn't. I was still bleeding, Miguel, literally and figuratively, and you were already talking about adoption, about other options. Because I thought it might help to have hope, to have something to look forward to, Miguel's controlled voice finally cracked. I was grieving too, Sophia. She was my daughter too. The truth of this statement, a truth Sophia had never fully acknowledged, hit her with the force of revelation. In her pain, she had claimed exclusive rights to their loss, had interpreted his forward thinking as a betrayal rather than his way of coping. She had shut him out because his grief didn't mirror her own, and in doing so, had doubled her loss. I know that now, she admitted. I couldn't see it then. I could barely see anything through the pain. Miguel nodded slowly. And now? It was such a simple question, carrying the weight of 3 years of silence, of separate lives constructed around a shared absence. Now I'm a different person, Sophia said honestly. Harder in some ways, maybe clearer in others. She paused. Carlos's death, it's making me look at what I've become, how I've isolated myself. I'm not sure I like what I see. That's a start, Miguel said, something like hope flickering briefly across his face. Before Sophia could respond, her pager buzzed, a reminder that despite personal tragedy, the hospital continued its relentless rhythm. A life in need of saving, decisions that couldn't wait. I have to go, she said, standing. Miguel looked up at her. Sophia, Elena is going to need help with arrangements. With everything, can we work together on this for her sake? Sophia recognized the olive branch for what it was. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but a starting point. A recognition that some connections persisted, even through silence and separation. Yes, she said, for her sake and for Carlos's. As she left the chapel, returning to the bright lights and urgent pace of the hospital corridors, Sophia felt something shift within her. Not healing, not yet, but perhaps the first acknowledgement that healing might be possible. That some distances, no matter how vast, could still be bridged. In the days that followed, Sophia discovered that grief had its own gravity, pulling people into unexpected orbits around each other. She took emergency leave from the hospital for the first time in her career, finding herself suddenly responsible for a mother who had always been fiercely independent, but was now adrift in sorrow. Elena moved temporarily into Sophia's Spartan apartment, a space that reflected its owner's emotional state, with its minimal furnishings, absence of personal photographs, and the untouched guest room that had once been intended as a nursery, but now served as storage for medical journals and conference materials. You still live like you're about to relocate at any moment, Elena observed on her second morning there. Looking around the kitchen where even the refrigerator magnets were utilitarian, appointment reminders and takeout menus rather than mementos. Sophia, brewing coffee with mechanical precision, felt defensive. I'm not home much. That's not living, Sophia. That's existing. Eleanor's grief seemed to have stripped away her usual diplomatic filters. Is this what you've been doing since the divorce, since Isabella? The casual mention of her daughter's name, a name rarely spoken aloud in Sophia's presence, made her hands falter, nearly spilling the coffee. Mum, this isn't the time. When is the time? Elena interrupted. Carlos is gone, just like that, without warning. Do you think we have the luxury of waiting for the right moment? The rawness of her mother's emotion silenced Sophia's objections. She set down the coffee pot carefully. What do you want from me? Elena's expression softened. I want you to stop hiding. From me, from Miguel, from yourself. She reached for Sophia's hand. Carlos's last wish. Do you know what it was? He wanted the family together again for his 70th birthday next month. He was planning to call you himself, to try to bridge this gap you've created. The revelation struck Sophia like a physical blow. Carlos had still considered her family, had still been making plans that included her, despite her systematic withdrawal from their lives. I didn't know, she said inadequately. How could you? You made yourself unreachable. Eleanor's tone wasn't accusatory, just sad. Sophia, I've respected your need for distance these past years, But I'm asking now, don't disappear again after the funeral. Don't retreat back into this half-life you've created. Before Sofia could respond, a knock at the door announced Miguel's arrival. He had been coordinating the funeral arrangements, liaising with Carlos's woodworking friends and former colleagues, handling the practical details that Elena couldn't face and Sofia didn't know how to approach. The sight of him in her apartment, this man who had once known every inch of her both physically and emotionally, created a dissonance Sofia wasn't prepared for. He moved with careful courtesy, as if conscious of trespassing in a space that had once been partly his, bringing coffee and pastries from the bakery they had once frequented together. "I've finalized the service details," he told Elena, setting out the food with casual domesticity that made Sofia feel like a stranger in her own kitchen. "Thursday at 3, as you wanted. The Carpentry Guild wants to do a special tribute. Apparently Carlos mentored half the craftsmen in the city." Elena nodded, attempting a smile. He'd like that. No fuss, just people who cared about him. She glanced at Sofia. "I should get dressed. Will you two be all right together for a few minutes?" The transparent attempt at forcing them into conversation would have been amusing under different circumstances. As it was, Sofia just nodded, avoiding Miguel's gaze as her mother left the room. "Subtle," Miguel commented when Elena was out of earshot. "She's never been good at hiding her agenda," Sofia agreed, reaching for a coffee cup to busy her hands. Miguel leaned against the counter, studying her. "She's worried about you. She's just lost her husband. She should be worried about herself." "That's not how Elena works, and you know it." Miguel's tone was gentle but firm. "She processes grief by focusing on others. Right now, that's you." Sofia sighed, recognizing the truth in his assessment. "And you, are you worried about me too?" The question emerged more vulnerable than she had intended. Miguel seemed to consider his answer carefully. "I'm concerned," he said finally. "This apartment, it's not you, Sofia. It's like you're living in a waiting room, not a home." The echo of her mother's sentiment wasn't lost on Sofia. "Maybe I've changed. Maybe this is me now." Miguel shook his head. "I don't believe that. The Sofia I knew filled our home with books and plants and weird artifacts from medical conferences. She left sticky notes with bad jokes on the bathroom mirror. She color-coded the spice rack and insisted on fresh flowers even during her 80-hour work weeks." The detailed recollection of her former self made Sofia's throat tighten. That woman seemed distant now, like a character in a story she'd once read. "That Sofia died with Isabella," she said quietly. Miguel was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had a new quality, not the careful neutrality he'd maintained since reappearing in her life, but something more raw, more urgent. "No, she didn't. You chose to lock her away, there's a difference." He moved closer, not touching her but diminishing the safe distance she'd maintained. "You know what I think? I think you're punishing yourself. For Isabella, for our marriage ending, for everything that went wrong. And the irony is, you're the only one blaming you." "That's not true," Sofia protested, but the words lacked conviction even to her own ears. "Isn't it? I never blamed you for what happened with Isabella. It was a medical tragedy, Sofia. You were a patient, not a doctor who failed. Not a mother who did something wrong." His words struck at the core of the guilt she had carried, the irrational but persistent belief that as a doctor she should have somehow prevented what happened, should have recognized the signs earlier, should have saved their daughter. "I keep thinking about Carlos," she said, changing the subject abruptly, "about all the time I wasted, all the conversations we'll never have." Miguel accepted the deflection. "I know. But Sofia, you can't change that. All you can do is make different choices going forward." The simplicity of this truth, and the implicit challenge within it, hung between them as Elena returned, dressed for the day, but moving with the deliberate care of someone whose body felt heavier than usual. "I'd like to go to the house today," she announced. "There are things I need to collect for the service, photos and such." Sofia and Miguel exchanged a glance, their personal tension temporarily set aside in shared concern for Elena. "I'll drive you," Sofia offered. "Actually," Elena said, "I'd like both of you to come. There are things decisions to be made, it would be easier to have you both there. And so they found themselves making the familiar drive to the craftsman-style home where Elena and Carlos had built their life together, a house Sofia had once visited weekly for Sunday dinners, but hadn't entered in 3 years. The last time she had been there was for an awkward lunch 6 months after the divorce, when the grief was still raw and conversation strained with things unsaid. The house looked exactly as Sofia remembered, the wide front porch with its handcrafted swing, the garden Elena tended with scientific precision, the warm wooden door that Carlos had made himself. It was Miguel who helped Elena up the steps, who steadied her as she fumbled with the key, who murmured something that made her smile briefly despite her grief. Inside, the house smelled of lemon polish and the faint, pleasant mustiness of old books, the scent of home that hit Sofia with unexpected force. She stood in the entryway, momentarily overwhelmed by sense memories. Holiday gatherings around the dining table visible through the archway, heated Scrabble competitions in the living room, the kitchen where Carlos had taught her to make his famous apple pie, while Miguel documented the process with his camera. "I'll put on some tea," Elena said, moving toward the kitchen with the autopilot of long habit. "I'll help," Miguel offered quickly, leaving Sofia alone in the living room. She moved slowly around the familiar space, noting the small changes of the past 3 years. New throw pillows, different arrangements of books, a collection of wood carvings that must have been Carlos's latest projects. On the mantel, family photos chronicled a history she had removed herself from. Elena and Carlos on a cruise at a friend's wedding, in the garden with their prize-winning roses, and there, partially hidden behind a newer frame, was a photo Sofia hadn't expected to find herself and Miguel on their wedding day, beaming at each other with the oblivious joy of people who believed their happiness was assured. Carlos had taken that photo, had captured that perfect moment of hope and promise that now felt like a relic from another life. Sofia picked up the frame, studying the image of her younger self, a woman who didn't yet know about loss, who believed that careful planning could prevent tragedy, who took for granted the people surrounding her. "He wouldn't let me put it away." Sofia turned to find her mother in the doorway, watching her with eyes that held understanding rather than accusation. "Even after everything," Elena continued, "he insisted that you were still part of this family, that the photo stayed." Sofia set the frame down carefully. "I should have come back, should have tried harder to stay connected." "Yes," Elena agreed simply. "You should have, but you were in pain, and pain makes us self-protective." She moved further into the room. "Carlos understood that better than most. Did you know his first wife left him? Before I met him?" Sofia shook her head, surprised. Carlos had rarely spoken about his life before Elena. "She couldn't have children," Elena explained. "They tried for years, suffered multiple miscarriages. Eventually the grief was too much for her. She left him, left the country, started a new life where she wouldn't be reminded of what she'd lost." She looked directly at Sofia. "He recognized the pattern in you." The parallel was uncomfortably close. Sofia had similarly fled, not to another country, but into her work, into emotional isolation. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. "Because Carlos would want you to know that he understood. And because," Elena's voice caught, "because he would want today to mean something, for his death to bring healing, not more distance." From the kitchen doorway, Miguel cleared his throat. "Tea's ready," he said, his expression suggesting he had heard enough to understand the conversation's gravity. They gathered in the sun-drenched kitchen, the heart of the house, where Carlos's presence seemed strongest, his handcrafted cabinets, his mug still in the dish drainer, his half-completed crossword on the counter. Elena poured tea with trembling hands, then reached for a folder that sat on the table. "Carlos's will," she explained. "His lawyer dropped it off yesterday. I've already reviewed it." She looked between Sofia and Miguel. "He left most things. To me, of course, the house, his savings, but there are 2 specific bequests I need to discuss with you both." Sofia felt a flicker of apprehension. She had expected to help her mother with practical arrangements, but this felt weightier, more consequential. Elena handed a sealed envelope to Miguel. His workshop and all his tools. He wanted you to have them, Miguel. He said you'd know what to do with them. Miguel accepted the envelope with visible emotion. I don't know what to say. That workshop was his sanctuary. He believed in your work, Elena said simply. He said an artist needs the right tools, and he trusted you to use them well. Sofia felt a complex emotion watching Miguel's response. Pride in Carlos's recognition of Miguel's talent, a bittersweet acknowledgement of the bond between the two men, and yes, a flicker of envy at the clear connection they had maintained, while her own relationship with Carlos had withered. And for you, Sofia, Elena continued, sliding a key across the table. The cabin. Sofia stared at the key in disbelief. The cabin, Carlos's hand-built retreat in the mountains, 2 hours. From the city, had been his passion project for years. The place where he had taught Sofia to fish, where he and Elena spent anniversaries, where Sofia and Miguel had conceived Isabella during a weekend getaway. Mom, no, that should be yours. It's what he wanted, Elena interrupted firmly. Read the letter that goes with it. With unsteady hands, Sofia opened the envelope Elena indicated. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in Carlos's distinctive, slightly cramped handwriting. Sofia, if you're reading this, I'm gone. And I've left you with the burden of a gift you probably don't want. The cabin that holds so many memories, both joyful and painful. You might be tempted to sell it immediately, don't. This place was always meant to be a sanctuary, somewhere to retreat when life becomes too much, but never somewhere to hide indefinitely. I'm giving it to you because I believe you need a place to heal, to remember who you were before grief reshaped you. I've watched you these past 3 years from a distance you enforced, but that I've honored. I've seen you become a shadow of yourself, still brilliant, still dedicated, but walled off from the parts of life that give it meaning. I know about loss, Sofia, about how tempting it is to close yourself off rather than risk feeling that pain again. The cabin is yours now. Use it as I intended, as a place to reconnect with yourself, with the parts you've locked away. There's a half-finished project in the workshop there that I'd like you to complete. Consider it my last request. With love and the hope that you'll find your way back. Carlos. Sofia looked up from the letter, her vision blurred. I don't understand. What project? Elena exchanged a glance with Miguel. He started building something last summer. He wouldn't tell me what it was. Said it was a surprise for the future. He mentioned it to me once, Miguel added quietly. Said it was something he should have finished years ago for someone who needed it. The cryptic description hung in the air between them. Sofia refolded the letter carefully, her physician's mind struggling to process the emotional complexity of the moment. When was the last time anyone was at the cabin? She asked. About a month ago, Elena replied. We were planning to go up next weekend, actually, to open it for the season. Sofia looked at the key in her hand, small, unremarkable, yet suddenly weighted with significance. A key to a place, filled with memories she had been avoiding, to a mystery Carlos had left behind, to a request she wasn't sure she had the emotional strength to fulfill. I'll go tomorrow, she said, surprising herself with the decision. I need to see what he was working on. Elena and Miguel exchanged another glance, a silent communication that excluded Sofia and reminded her sharply of how much had changed, how their dynamics had shifted in her absence. I could drive you, Miguel offered cautiously. The mountain roads might be bad after the spring rains. Sofia's instinct was to refuse, to maintain the careful distance she'd established, but Carlos's letter nagged at her conscience, his final request, his belief that she needed healing. And perhaps having Miguel there would make it easier to face whatever awaited her at the cabin. All right, she conceded, but we drive separately. I'll need my own car to get back to the hospital if there's an emergency. Miguel nodded, accepting the boundaries she was setting. I'll follow you up. Elena watched this negotiation with barely concealed hope, which Sofia pretended not to notice. Her mother had always believed that Sofia and Miguel's separation was temporary, a conviction that had only complicated Sofia's own grieving process. As they prepared to leave, Sophia paused in Carlos's study, a small room filled with books on woodworking and nature, sketches of future projects pinned to a corkboard, the lingering scent of his pipe tobacco despite years of Elena's gentle admonishments about his health. She ran her fingers along the spines of his books, noting the dog-eared pages and handwritten notes in the margins. This room, perhaps more than any other in the house, captured Carlos's essence, methodical yet creative, precise yet warm. He spent a lot of time in here the past year, Elena said, appearing in the doorway. Said he was researching something important. Sophia picked up a book on traditional wooden toys, its cover worn from frequent handling. Did he say what? Elena shook her head. He could be secretive about his projects until they were ready. Said creation needed privacy. She smiled faintly. I think you'll understand when you see the cabin. The conversation felt weighted with meaning Sophia couldn't quite grasp, as if Carlos had set in motion something that only she could complete, though she didn't yet understand what or why. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of spring day that felt like a gift after months of winter gloom. Sophia packed lightly, just a change of clothes, some food, and her doctor's instinct for preparation that manifested as a well-stocked first aid kit. She told herself this was a quick trip, just long enough to see Carlos's project and fulfill his request, nothing more. When Miguel pulled up in his weathered Jeep, Sophia was already waiting outside her apartment building. He offered to take her bag, a simple courtesy she accepted with awkward formality. The careful dance of former intimates, now practically strangers. Elena gave me the cabin key last night, he said, as they settled into their respective vehicles, in case we need to split up the drive. Sophia nodded, relieved to have an excuse, not to ride together for the 2-hour journey. I'll lead the way. The drive into the mountains offered a buffer of solitude that Sophia needed. She followed the familiar route, the highway giving way to smaller roads, then to the winding mountain pass that led to the secluded valley where Carlos had built his retreat. With each mile, the landscape changed, becoming more rugged, more elemental. The city's constant hum faded, replaced by the deeper quiet of forests and streams. Sophia found herself relaxing incrementally, the tension she carried in her shoulders beginning to ease. She had forgotten this feeling, the particular liberation of leaving urban confines, of spaces opening up around her. In her rearview mirror, Miguel's Jeep maintained a respectful distance, neither pressing too close nor falling too far behind. The cabin appeared exactly as Sophia remembered, a substantial structure of timber and stone that Carlos had built himself with Elena's architectural guidance. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by pines, a stream burbling nearby, the mountains rising in the distance. Not ostentatious, but solid and welcoming, with a deep porch wrapping around 2 sides and windows positioned to capture light throughout the day. Sophia parked and sat for a moment, steeling herself against the rush of memories. The last time she had been here was just before her pregnancy, a weekend retreat with Miguel when their marriage was still golden with promise, when their future seemed luminous and assured. They had planned to bring their child here, to introduce her to the wilderness, to Carlos's craftsmanship, to the simple joys of nature. Miguel pulled up beside her, his expression carefully neutral as he surveyed the cabin. Looks the same, he observed, joining her as she climbed out of her car. Yes, Sophia agreed, feeling the weight of shared history between them. I half expected it to have changed somehow. They approached the cabin together, the gravel path, crunching beneath their feet. Sophia used her key in the front door, the mechanism turning smoothly as if recently oiled. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood and sunlight, with none of the mustiness one might expect from a place closed up for weeks. Someone's been here recently, Miguel said, confirming Sophia's suspicion. The main room was just as she remembered, open and warm with a stone fireplace at one end, comfortable furnishings arranged for conversation, bookshelves filled with novels and field guides. Carlos's craftsmanship was evident everywhere, in the exposed beams overhead, the built-in cabinets, the dining table that could seat 12. Every piece of furniture showed his hand, solid yet elegant, functional yet beautiful. But there were also subtle changes, New cushions on the window seat, different artwork on the walls, a collection of carved birds that hadn't been there before. Signs of life continuing, of Carlos and Elena's ongoing relationship with this place even as Sofia had excised it from her life. "The workshop is out back," Miguel said unnecessarily. They both knew the layout intimately. Sofia nodded, dropping her bag on the sofa. Let's see what he was working on. The workshop was a separate structure, smaller than the main cabin but just as lovingly constructed. Inside, the familiar scents of sawdust, varnish, and machine oil created an olfactory portrait of Carlos. His tools hung in precise arrangement. On pegboards, his workbench is clear, except for a single project in the center of the main table. Sofia approached it slowly, Miguel beside her, both of them drawn to Carlos's final creation. Under a protective cloth lay a partially completed wooden cradle, not a simple bassinet, but an heirloom piece with intricately carved panels depicting forest scenes, animals, and what appeared to be a fairy tale narrative flowing from one panel to the next. Sofia's breath caught. She reached out a trembling hand to touch the smooth wood, recognizing Carlos's distinctive carving style. The craftsmanship was exquisite, even in its unfinished state, the wood glowing warmly in the light streaming through the workshop windows. "It's a cradle," Miguel said, his voice thick with emotion. "For Isabella," Sofia whispered, understanding flooding her. Carlos had been building a cradle for the grandchild he had lost, the child whose absence had splintered their family. Beside the cradle lay Carlos's sketch pad, open to detailed drawings of the remaining panels. The completed sections told the beginning of a story, a child's journey through an enchanted forest, meeting helpful creatures along the way. The unfinished sketches showed the rest of the tale, challenges overcome, lessons learned, a return home transformed. "He was building this for us," Miguel said, his voice strained. For the future." Sofia couldn't speak. The realization of what Carlos had been doing, creating this beautiful object not as a memorial to what was lost, but as a vessel for hope, for possibility, overwhelmed her carefully constructed defenses. The cradle wasn't just for Isabella, it was for the family they might still become in whatever form that took. "There's a letter," Miguel said, picking up an envelope that had been tucked beneath the sketch pad. Sofia's name was written on it, in Carlos's distinctive hand. With unsteady fingers, she opened it. "Sofia, but by now you've seen the cradle. I started it after Elena told me you'd frozen your remaining embryos rather than destroying them. She shouldn't have told me. I know it was private, but she needed someone to share that small hope with. I don't know what your plans are, or if you'll ever choose to try again, with Miguel, with someone else, or on your own. That's not for me to decide, but I wanted to create something that would be waiting if that day ever comes. The cradle isn't finished, because your story isn't finished, Sofia. Grief carves us hollow, but it also creates space for new life to eventually take root. I've seen how you've closed yourself off these past years, and I understand why. But a heart that's shut down can't heal. I'm asking you to finish what I've started. Not just the cradle, but the journey back to yourself. Miguel has agreed to help teach you the techniques you'll need, though he doesn't know what you're building or why. Work together. Heal together, even if your paths ultimately diverge. Remember what I taught you about woodworking. Sometimes the grain doesn't run the way you expect. You have to work with it, not against it. The same is true of life after loss. With all, my love, Carlos. Sofia looked up from the letter to find Miguel watching her, concern evident in his expression. "What does it say?" he asked. She handed him the letter wordlessly, unable to summarize its contents, needing him to understand the full weight of what Carlos had set in motion. As he read, she turned back to the cradle, running her fingers along the smooth edges, the half-finished carvings, seeing in them not just Carlos's craftsmanship, but his profound belief in continued life, in healing, in futures not yet written. Miguel finished reading and set the letter down gently. When Sofia finally met his gaze, she saw that his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Did you know?" she asked. About the embryos? He shook his head. You never told me you kept them. I assumed after the divorce, after everything, that you had let them go. I couldn't, Sophia admitted. The truth she had held close for 3 years finally spoken aloud. I told myself it was just medical caution, not closing doors permanently. But really, I couldn't bear to lose that last piece. Of her, of us. Miguel moved closer, still maintaining a careful distance but breaching the emotional wall she had constructed. Why didn't you tell me? Because it felt like the only thing I had control over anymore, Sophia said, the realization forming as she spoke. My body had failed, our marriage had failed, my career was the only thing left that made sense. The embryos, they were a possibility I wasn't ready to examine, but couldn't bring myself to end. Miguel nodded slowly, absorbing this. And now? Sophia looked at the unfinished cradle, the tangible evidence of Carlos's faith in renewal, in continued life. Now I don't know, I came here expecting. I don't know what I expected, not this. He was always looking ahead, Miguel said, a faint smile touching his lips. Remember how he used to plant trees he'd never lived to see mature? Said it was his responsibility to future generations. The memory softened something in Sophia. He planted an orchard the week after our wedding. Said our grandchildren would climb those trees someday. They stood in silence, both absorbed in the weight of Carlos's final project. Not just a piece of furniture, but a bridge between past and future, a vessel for possibility. I don't know how to finish it, Sophia said, finally gesturing to the cradle. I never had his skill with wood. That's why he said I'd help teach you, Miguel replied. I've been working with him the past year, learning his techniques. He paused. I didn't know what we were preparing for. He just said someday it would make sense. The realization that Carlos had been orchestrating this reunion long before his death struck Sophia with bittersweet clarity. He had seen what they couldn't, that healing might require them to face each other again, to collaborate on something that honored both their loss and the possibility of renewal. I can't stay long, Sophia said, practical considerations reasserting themselves. I have patients, responsibilities. I know, Miguel said, but we could come back, weekends maybe, work on it together until it's finished. He gestured to the cradle, not with any expectations about us, but because Carlos asked, and because, he hesitated, choosing his words carefully, because maybe we both need to finish something we started. Sophia looked at him, really looked at him for the first time since he had reappeared in her life. The years had changed him, new lines around his eyes, a steadier presence, a patience that came from enduring what couldn't be changed. But his essential nature remained, the artist's sensitivity, the quiet strength she had first been drawn to. All right, she said finally. For Carlos. For Carlos, Miguel echoed, though something in his expression suggested it might be for more than that, for Isabella, for themselves, for the people they had been and might become. As they left the workshop, the sunlight slanting through the trees created dappled patterns on the path. Sophia paused, looking back at the small building that now held not just Carlos's final project, but a tentative bridge toward her own uncertain future. Do you want to stay? Miguel asked. Just for tonight, there's food in the freezer, Carlos. Always kept it stocked. We could start planning how to approach the project. Sophia's instinct was to refuse, to retreat to the safety of her organized, controlled life. But Carlos's words echoed in her mind. A heart that's shut down can't heal. Yes, she said, surprising herself with the simplicity of her answer. I'd like that. As they walked back to the main cabin, a comfortable silence between them, Sophia felt something shift within her. Not forgiveness, not yet. Not healing, but perhaps the first acknowledgement that healing was possible. That some distances, no matter how carefully maintained, could still be bridged. That some endings contained within them the seeds of new beginnings. In the gathering twilight, as Miguel built a fire in the hearth and Sophia prepared a simple meal from the provisions they found, the cabin seemed to hold its breath, waiting, perhaps for its inhabitants to remember how to live within its walls, how to honor the past while still moving forward, how to finish what had been started not just by Carlos, but by their own younger selves who had once believed so completely in shared futures. Outside, the forest settled into evening rhythms, birds calling their day's end songs, the stream's constant murmur, the whisper of wind through pine needles. Inside, two people who had once known each other better than anyone else began the careful, tentative work of rediscovery. Not as the couple they had been, but as the individuals they had become, shaped by loss but not defined by it, carrying the weight of echoes but not drowning in them. And somewhere, Sophia thought, Carlos was watching, patient as always, believing in growth that might take years to manifest, planting seeds whose flowering he would never witness, but had faith would eventually bloom.